Welcome into the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast. This is episode 10. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Formula One and the effect of not having any races on the finances. To quote French novelist Marcel Proust, quote, "But instead of what our imagination makes us suppose, and which we worthlessly try to discover, life gives us something that we could hardly imagine." COVID has affected business, many different businesses in many different ways. And it's a subject that will probably have many books written about it, perhaps one by us at some time, but we'll leave that thorough look for a later date. But I think we're presented here with a unique opportunity in that we've got a company's financials in the Formula One group where they've not had any events take place. They've not had any events take place where they normally would have many events take place. And this provides an opportunity for us to kind of dive into the financials a little bit and see if anything can be learned from comparing to last year when they had events and when it was a normal season, actually a record-setting season in many ways, comparing it to this year where there were no events and see what effect that has. A lot of it's going to be fairly obvious, but there's some detail that we might glean from it. So we'll kind of dive in here to the most recent filing by the Formula One group. And as we discussed on a previous episode, episode 8, where we went into John Malone's Liberty Media's purchase of Formula One for an enterprise value of just over $8 billion. And we're not going to go into that here. If you have interest in that transaction, please go back and listen to episode 8. It's an entire 30-minute episode on the transaction. But in this episode, we're going to look at basically and compare this year's financials where there were no events to last year's financials where there were events and see what we can learn. So a couple questions that might come to the forefront. Clearly, revenues will be down, but by how much? What will their costs look like? What costs can be avoided? What costs have to stay on the books? What does the liquidity of the company look like? And we'll explore all of that here. So to kind of just frame this up, Formula One's a big business. As we mentioned in the episode 8, which again I'd encourage you to go listen to. It's a business that sold for $8 billion in 2016. And that followed a year where they produced roughly $450 million in cash. And as we look at this quarterly report that ended June 30th, 2020, that sort of takes place during the time of COVID, when there were really no events taking place. So digging into their quarterly financial report, and this is a sports business. This is a business that was affected probably disproportionately to other businesses. Sports and entertainment, a business that makes money by gathering fans together and on-site activation is really going to be hit hard. Bars, concerts, sporting events obviously took a big hit, a maximal hit, basically. Other businesses did well. This business, sports business, struggled. This quarterly report that ends June 30th, 2020, the same 3-month period ending June 30th from 2019 and the 6-month period ending June 30th, 2019 had 7 and 9 events respectively versus none in 2020. So again, can this tell us anything about the business? You have a company that had 7 to 9 events, now it has no events. What can this tell us about the business? So let's find out. I think we can learn something here. So let's start at the top line, revenue. In the 3-month period ending June 30th, 2019, Formula One Group did $620 million in revenue. In that same period, ending 2020, they did $24 million in revenue. So $24 million versus $620 million. And again, that was with 7 events taking place, 7 races of the 21 from that previous year versus 0, again, taking place in the 2020 period. And then when you go to the 6-month period, the revenue is $63 million for 2020 versus $866 million for 2019. And again, in that case, it's 9 events versus no events. And just as a note here, Formula One did 21 events total in 2019 and was looking originally to do 22 events in 2020, but they have ended up moving that to 13 events, with some events being canceled and rescheduled, and a July start date, which we know. So now that we've got revenue, let's look at cost of doing business. So on the $24 million that they earned, again, they earned $24 million versus the $620 million of the year before. On the $24 million that they earned for that 3-month period, the cost of the revenue was $16 million, and the SG&A, so selling, general, administrative expenses, were $24 million. And that's compared to a cost of revenue of $441 million for the previous year and an SG&A of $34 million. So you see the SG&A is $34 million versus $24 million, so it's very close. And then the cost of sales, that's where the big gap is. So what does that mean? That means the SG&A stayed relatively similar. Although it's down 30%, there were no races. No races took place, so okay. And that means that the $24 million represents a large portion of fixed costs to the business potentially, and that they, didn't furlough a lot of employees potentially. It's salaried employees, rents, etc., all fit in that $24 million, SG&A, and that didn't change too much. Going $34 million to $24 million with no races, that's not a huge change, and sort of to be expected to some degree. And the big jump in costs that $16 million to $441 million, that is a big variance, obviously driven by the fact that there were no races. So that's interesting. So what are the costs? Who is normally paid that money? Well, in this case, it's the teams. The Formula One teams are actually paid that money from the Formula One group. They work together and they share revenue. So Formula One not having its events, the 7 and 9 events respectively, saved itself these big team payments. So there was a team payment of $335 million for that 3-month period in 2019 and $431 million for the 6-month period in 2019. So as you might imagine, and this doesn't come as a surprise, they share revenue. This Formula One group that contracts with the FIA to put on the races shares money with the teams. The teams, have an earnings. What the teams have and share is basically a pot of money, and it's based on the TV broadcast rights, the event licensing fees, the event fees. So Formula One charges the cities to host the events. It actually charges, in many cases, the hotels to be able to offer their rooms to the people that travel with F1 and that kind of stuff. And that pot of money, again, is based on that. So it's very similar to, in the NFL, you've got the salary cap is basically directly related to the TV numbers. So the example with the NFL, you've got the TV numbers coming in for $5 billion, and that's divided up by the teams, and each team gets, the $189 million or whatever. And that's similar in this case, although it's certainly not divided evenly by the teams, but they enter into a pot of money that is then distributed. So to give you an idea, that pot of money, and this is according to Statista.com, in 2016, the pot of money was $966 million. In 2017, the pot of money was $919 million. In 2018, the pot of money was $913 million. And then in 2019, it was actually a record at $1.012 billion. And that's what was divided up, and that represents that $335 million that was paid for the 7-race period and the $431 million that was paid for the 9-race period. So that's how that pot is split up. So again, it's pretty intuitive, but something to kind of think about just looking at the Formula One group as a business. A big cost of their revenue, a big cost to their revenue seems to be in this kind of contractual nature and proportional sharing nature. So to kind of contrast it, and again, this is kind of intuitive, but just to kind of frame it up, the Formula One group, it's very different than, say, a manufacturer, or even someone manufacturing bicycles or cars or whatever. You've got a lot of things that go into your cost of goods sold. You've got a lot of skilled labor. You've got inventory, raw inventory, all these different types of things that factor in to the business. And if you were to, say, get your sales cut down to 10% of what they were before in a very short period of time, and then you anticipate those rising again, which is kind of in this COVID situation, you would have big costs that you would have to maintain. Now, if you think that 5 years from now your demand's going to be 10% of what it was, then yes, of course you can slowly get your workforce down and maybe your factory floor footprint down and that kind of stuff. But those types of businesses, a manufacturing business that is going to go from 100% capacity down to 10% capacity for a few months and then back up to 100% capacity, of course that's going to be a very high cost, sticky environment. Now, the Formula One group does have the SG&A costs. It does have some fixed costs associated with the revenue, but the bulk of their revenue is in this sharing environment. So again, that's interesting, and that's where they potentially diverge a little bit from the teams, although of course the teams obviously make a lot more money competing. Okay, so let's break down that revenue a little bit. It's $24 million, as we mentioned, for that 3-month period ending July 30th, 2020. And $12 million of that was regular Formula One revenue, and $12 million was what they characterized as other revenue. So what is this other revenue? And again, just to kind of mention, on the 6-month period, the other revenue was $38 million this year and $137 million in 2019. So what is the other revenue? They classify it as basically the following. The facilitation of the shipment of cars to and from events outside of Europe. So Formula One Group charges a fee to the teams to facilitate that transport. The sale of Paddock Club tickets at events. So obviously the sale of the Paddock Club tickets at events and the facilitation of shipment of cars to and from Europe did not occur at all in this period. And then they've got licensing and fees that they charge for the other levels of racing, Formula 2 and 3, and then digital and social media services. So they got $12 million, basically depended on how the licensing and fees are structured with Formula 2 and 3. Potentially some of that was in there, and then the other would be the digital and social media services. So that's other revenue. And a note that in the 2019 other revenue report, they noted that there was sales of Formula 3 chassis to the Formula 3 teams, and that those are on a 3-year cycle, so that would be non-recurring. So that factored in some to the other revenue from 2019, and that's an interesting fact. So that's kind of the revenue, kind of the top line. And some of the major costs associated with Formula One in this given time period. But with that being said, as far as even these costs, many of these costs associated with the race and with the revenue sharing, able to be avoided to some degree, they still ran a loss, as you can imagine. So the operating income before depreciation and amortization, or OIBDA, was negative $16 million for the 3 months ending June 30th, 2020, versus $145 million positive for that same period ending in 2019. So that's a big difference. And then negative $48 million for the 6-month period versus $210 million in profit. So big loss there. And that's to be expected. Now let's take a look, kind of shift gears and look at the cash flow. So the cash flow from operating activities for Formula One, and this is just kind of running through the reporting. So the cash flow from operating activities Formula One for this period was negative 99 million versus 199 million positive in 2019. Cash flow from investing activities was up 101 million versus negative 21 million. 2019 cash flow provided by financing was 1.1 billion in 2020 versus negative 4 million in 2019. Just a note, Formula One borrowed against their revolving credit facility and repaid that balance in full. And this is a $500 million revolving credit facility that is based on, LIBOR plus. And in 2019, they were able to negotiate it for LIBOR plus 2%. So again, none of this is totally surprising. I just kind of wanted to run through some of the numbers and look at what the effect is of having no events, really, and what costs kind of remain in Formula One and in the Formula One group, and what costs can be avoided, and how much money is paid to the teams, et cetera, versus the revenue that comes in general to the sport and to the group. Another note, just out of intrigue, the FIA agreement that Formula One has. And the FIA is the regulatory body, and they regulate the competitive aspects of Formula One, and Formula One Group owns and puts on the sport, basically. That FIA agreement that they have with the FIA to be able to put on these races, they have on their balance sheet at $3.6 billion, the Formula One Group. Just FYI. So again, nothing super crazy, but it is interesting when we look at the effects of the virus on business. And like I said, there's a lot more to talk about there. I think people will write books on it, to be honest, many books, once everything kind of settles. But, it is interesting. Basically Formula One went from 866 million, basically almost half their season, to 63 million. So without events, can't make a lot of money doing the business. And again, that makes sense. We'll know a lot more in the next quarterly report, and we'll probably run through that in a future episode. But again, just kind of wanted to run through and look at Formula One's financial situation. Formula One itself holds, I believe, 1.7 billion in cash, and it's, obviously involved with Liberty Media. So it's not in a cash position that it can't get out of. It's not in a liquidity crisis. It's not in a going concern issue. It doesn't look like, obviously, especially now with the events starting back up. But they did take a hit, and a lot of that revenue will not be recovered in the latter part of the year. Some will, but 13 events, no fans, it'll be different. So we'll get a lot more on the next report in terms of the actual broadcast rights numbers and how much cash is actually realized from that, with having events without people watching. So that's very interesting. A note, and I'll just kind of throw it out here, of course, Williams Formula One team was sold to a U.S. company, and I just wanted to talk really briefly about that. Williams was pretty unique in that they, built their own chassis, and quite honestly, they won a lot of races. And they had other businesses. They had Williams Advanced Engineering and Williams Hybrid Power, and they actually sold off Williams Advanced Engineering previous to this deal, where the Doralton Capital purchased them. They actually sold off that component before this. They had a $13 million loss, and they sold off the Williams Advanced Engineering in part to stem that $13 million loss. They sold the Williams Advanced Engineering for $39 million. And again, that was prior to this deal going through, so it's a deal we'll probably look at in more detail in future episodes, but I just kind of wanted to quickly touch on that. Yeah, it's a very interesting situation. But there you have it. That's a little bit about Formula One and about sort of the COVID's effect on its finances, and just a little dive in to kind of see what things look like with no events versus having events. And we hope that you enjoyed that. And thank you. And please like and subscribe. And we've got a couple of YouTube channels we're building. We've got the channel that's more finance based, financial videos. You can find that. It's just ArtGibbs on YouTube. Then we've got the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast channel where we upload this podcast. And then we've got an ArtGibbs Sports Business Clips where we'll take certain clips and certain things throughout the episodes and upload them there as well. So we've got those YouTube channels to check out. So feel free to check them out and comment there as well. We appreciate it. Thank you.